by supporting, training, financially resourcing, and coaching BIPOC people living with HIV to participate effectively in HIV decrim efforts. And so this is a project of the Health Not Prisons Collective, and we are just really excited to have 7 Health Not Prisons advocates with us and some continuing on in their second year of the project. We also have the PWN Policy Fellows, which is a fellowship. It's in its 6th year at PWN. It's a year-long training program designed to really support women, trans, and non-binary people living with HIV to gain skills and policy advocacy. And this year we have developed a curriculum for both the HNPA advocates as well as the policy fellows to skill build and learn together around policy advocacy. We will be holding a monthly training between now and the culminating in and ending in June of 2024. So we're really excited to be sharing this series of trainings, not only with the PWN policy fellows and HNP advocates, but also our broader PWN members and base, so that we can all learn together in gaining our policy advocacy skills. Because we know that policies will have better outcomes for our communities when those who are most directly impacted are leading us. And PWN really is committed to building a world that we actually want to see, right? Where all women, trans, gender expansive, and non-binary people living with HIV can live long, healthy, and dignified lives. And so our curriculum is grounded in gender and racial justice and focuses on increasing the knowledge of how policy decisions are made, how we can impact them, and how to advocate for transformation. And so this training is just one of many that we will be holding in this next year to develop our policy skills together. And follow the HNP Collective and PWN-USA on social media. We are on Facebook and Instagram, and the handles are here on the slide. So today's learning objectives, we have several very lofty goals for today's training. The first is to learn key differences between state and federal advocacy. We're going to learn the branches of government. We're going to learn how federal policy shapes state and local policy, and learn about state legislative advocacy as well. So some quick logistics and agreements for today. We are recording and live streaming. Please share your name, pronouns, and location in the chat if you would like to introduce yourself. There are really no dumb questions. This is supposed to be, again, a learning space for all of us. We welcome you to ask your questions in the chat or raise your hand as we're presenting, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. We have a lot of content to go through today, so we'll try to get through everything effectively. So please ask your questions in the chat, and we'll keep track of them as well. And with that, I'm very thrilled and excited to introduce our presenters. Unfortunately, I believe, do we have Frida on? Feel free to unmute yourself if you are on, Frida. But I believe Frida was last minute not able to join us today, so I'll go ahead and cover. Me and Breanna are going to go ahead and tag team and cover Frida's slides. Yeah, and again, my name is Amanda. I use she, her pronouns. I am the If, When, How Reproductive Justice HIV Fellow with PWN. And then we have Breanna Diaz. Breanna uses she, they pronouns, and she is a policy and legislative counsel at the ACLU of Virginia and past staff of PWN-USA. So we are so excited to have Breanna join us again today. Just really thrilled and thankful to you, Breanna, for sharing your time and expertise and knowledge with us. Wonderful. So with that, I will go ahead and we'll we'll dive right in. I wanted to provide a quick grounding on just a grounding on policy and advocacy, what exactly it is. So what is policy? A set of ideas or a plan of what to do in particular situations that has been agreed to officially by a group of people, a business organization, a government, or a political party. And so this sounds like really kind of in the weeds maybe, and kind of like high in the sky, or just kind of like an idea, but really policy impacts our lives every day. It is universal healthcare. Policy impacts economic justice. It impacts ending criminalization, which is what our Health Not Prisons advocates are working towards in their states, of ending HIV criminalization. Right now, we're seeing an onslaught of attacks on LGBTQ people, trans folks, and gender affirming healthcare. This means that policy impacts trans rights, safety, and justice. We've seen with the end of the fall of Roe and the Dobbs decision that policy impacts sexual reproductive health, rights, and justice. And so really policy impacts every facet of our lives every day. Advocacy, what is advocacy? Advocacy is any action that speaks in favor, recommends, argues for or against a cause, supports or defends or pleads on behalf of others. Advocacy happens both every day as well, like in our lives and our personal lives, in our communities and our neighborhoods, but also it happens in legislatures, it happens in our local government meetings. It includes public education, regulatory work, litigation, work before administrative bodies. You'll see in our next training that we'll be covering administrative advocacy versus legislative advocacy, and how that works on a federal level. We have voter registration and voter education is advocacy as well. And I know that y'all on this call have already done a lot of advocacy work, both at a local and federal level. And so, yeah, just really excited. And feel free to kind of add in your experiences around advocacy in the chat as we go along as well. We'd love to hear. So this is kind of the very broad overview of the differences in state and federal advocacy. We'll do a deeper dive in the next hour or so around the differences in the state and federal government. But advocacy looks different within the state and federal government, right? So every state is different, is very different. In the federal government, you see kind of one kind of structure that every person in the US can kind of learn, but in every state, there's a mini kind of federal government within each state that that is different, and it has its own rules and structures. So it is something that everyone can learn, and it is going to be, the details are going to be different within every state. Some things can be accomplished at the state level that can't be accomplished at the federal level, and vice versa, right? There are things that happen at the state level that get passed, for example, laws that get passed at the state level that really only apply to the state and the folks within that state. States can be quicker to responding and more willing to experiment with policy ideas. You'll see, for example, in California, where after the fall of Roe, California and other states sought to increase access to abortion, whereas other states very quickly restricted access to abortion. And state advocacy, local advocates usually drive the agenda, right? Versus in the federal context, you have a lot of kind of repeat actors or folks who are regularly at the Capitol. They're often kind of like those larger organizations that have the resources to be in Washington, D.C. to affect that change. But at the state advocacy level, we have local advocates within our communities really able to drive the agenda, which really shows the power of organizing and being able to be in community with each other to work towards change that you want to see. State lawmakers also have fewer resources sometimes than federal ones, but that also means that sometimes state lawmakers have more. You have more access to state lawmakers, right? So federal lawmakers at the Capitol are, sometimes at Capitol, sometimes within their constituency or state. And so you'll have varying levels of access to your federal lawmakers versus state lawmakers are, you can run into them if you're in kind of like the state capital area, you can run into them getting coffee at a nearby coffee shop, or you can more easily meet with them sometimes if you're able to travel to your state capital. And so quickly, we'll go over this as well in the federal, in terms of the branches of government. So we'll do a deeper dive, but we just, as a broad overview, the usual branches. So the branches of the government include the Constitution, which provides this document called that provides this idea of a separation of powers, right? So the separation of powers is this idea that one branch of the government shouldn't hold all the power, and that one should have kind of this checks and balances against one another, right? So we have the legislative branch. This is the Congress at a federal level, and the legislative branch is tasked with making laws. We have the executive branch, which is often thought of as the president and the vice president. And this is a branch that carries out the laws. And then we have the judicial branch. So many of us are familiar with the Supreme Court of the United States, often kind of in shorthand called SCOTUS. So the judicial branch, as well as, so there we have the Supreme Court and also other federal courts. So there's different levels of federal courts as well, below the Supreme Court. And so the judicial branch interprets our laws. Okay, and then let me just double check to see that if we have Breanna. Okay, so we don't have Breanna, so we'll go ahead and I will go ahead and cover the federal government, and I will tag Breanna in as well for support as we cover these slides. And so feel free to ask your questions in the chat too as we are going along. So the federal government. So as mentioned, we have the judicial branch. We have the Supreme Court. As mentioned, this is the highest court in the federal system. We are in a month right now in which the Supreme Court is coming to its unofficial kind of term end. And that's when we see a lot of cases being released by the Supreme Court, and a lot of controversial cases, right? Or quote unquote controversial cases that impact our lives, and that a lot of folks have been keeping an eye on in this last month. So the Supreme Court has 9 justices. They are located in Washington, D.C. And within the Supreme Court, there's also so the task of the Supreme Court, again, it's the highest court of the federal system. It is basically the appeals jurisdiction. So courts kind of make their cases make their way from a district court level, which is the lowest one you'll see on this slide, up into the courts of appeal. And after that, it goes to the Supreme Court. And so that's how cases are usually heard at the Supreme Court level. It goes through these various levels of the federal courts and eventually to the Supreme Court. Right below, you have the courts of appeals, which is the intermediate level of the federal system court. There are 12 circuit courts, including DC Circuit. And this is the kind of intermediate level. So once a case gets appealed to the courts of appeal, it could also then go to the Supreme Court, as mentioned. We have the district courts, right? Those are the lowest level in the federal system. Those district courts are located in 94 judicial districts in 50 states and territories. There is no, and district courts, there's a lot of cases within district courts. There are a lot of folks filing cases within district courts. And so this is where we'll see a lot of case law or cases that kind of impact our communities, kind of sometimes on a more local level. Breanna, did I miss anything?
No, I think you nailed it.
Okay, great. So then we have the executive branch. We have the president's cabinet. So the executive branch is often thought of as the president, right? You have the president, the vice president. We have the cabinet of the president. So this includes all of the different agencies and the appointed, and the president appoints basically the leads of each of these departments. And again, the executive branch is tasked with kind of implementing the laws, right? Yeah. And Breanna, do you have any other additions around the executive branch in particular?
Let me see. I apologize if I'm repeating anything you said, Amanda, but I would just emphasize that, within the three branches of government, the executive oversees, executing the laws of the land, but the laws can be so far-reaching and encompassing that one person or one department isn't able to oversee the implementation of a law. And so over time, we have created these departments that are issue-based that really focus on developing rules, regulations, and policies, as well as compliance and enforcement of federal law. And so I think some key examples that folks are most familiar with are like the Department of Health and Human Services. That oversees a lot of federal programmatic law and work that impacts folks living with HIV. Same can be said for the Department of Education that oversees non-discrimination law. And there's so many more departments. I know Amanda has them all listed there, but I just wanted to, I think, emphasize that these departments oversee the implementation of every law in the United States and ensures that, or, I'm putting in quotation marks, ensures that they're being implemented consistent with law and policy and personal priorities.
Awesome. Thanks, Breanna. Great. And I have a question in the chat. So when we do our advocacy, we would be dealing directly with the legislative branch, correct? So that's a really good question. Actually, you can, so you wouldn't actually just only be, there's a lot of areas within the branches of government in which you can advocate. And that includes the executive branch, as Breanna mentioned, in terms of administrative advocacy, which we'll cover more in depth actually in the next training, but also legislative advocacy as well, which that actually brings me to our next slide. Congress. Oh, actually, we also have a question from Deborah. So we'll go ahead and let Deborah ask her question.
Hi, everyone. I just want to understand something. You already spoke about the Legislative Council branch, executive, and judiciary. So I just want to understand, because if you're talking about the legislative branch, I know we have them in the states. So how do this, when you said it's separation, the branches is because of separation of power. So how do they actually separate powers? Because if we have those legislative council in the states, how do they get to the federal level? I don't understand. I'm trying to compare how the separation of power really works here.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Deborah. And I think you're that is showing kind of you're connecting the dots between the federal and the state. This is exactly what Breanna is actually going to be covering later on in the presentation. Breanna, I don't know if you have a short kind of answer, or if that's something we'll parse out later too in the training later on.
I am not one known for short answers, so I won't have one here, but we will totally unpack that, Deborah. And if by the end of the presentation, if you believe the question wasn't answered, let's re-uplift it and further unpack it. But I believe Amanda will set us up with the foundation. And when we get to the state legislative portion, I'll fill in, I think, the rest of the information that clarifies separation of powers. Thank you for your question, though.
Thanks, Deborah. And thanks, Breanna. With that, I know, so we're trying to make this training as interactive as possible, and we want to hear from you. So I covered already the judicial and the executive branches. So in the chat, if we would love to hear from you. What is either one Supreme Court case that you've heard about lately? This is, as I mentioned, the judicial branch of the government, of the federal government. Or what branch of government are you interested in learning more about? I think Deborah asked a question kind of more interested in kind of like the legislative branch. And I know we've had a couple questions and it seems like folks are really familiar with the legislative branch. So I'm excited to dive in more about into that. But yeah, feel free to add in the chat kind of what Supreme Court case that you've been following lately or what branch of government you're interested in learning more about. Yes, definitely. I think we just this month it was the 1 year anniversary of the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, and you know, I think that's a really I think sobering milestone that we've made in terms of just the impact that case has had right throughout the country and within our communities and access to abortion. And so I think that is a really important, obviously, case that a lot of folks have been, dealing with the impacts of. That is, yeah, we have Roe v. Wade, we have Texas attacks on trans children and RJ. I know Breanna will also cover a good a slide on this as well. A lot of folks interested in learning more about the legislative branch. Yes, we have the Braidwood case. I see Shakina, MJ, affirmative action. Yes, another really another case before the Supreme Court. Yeah, thanks everyone for adding all these really important cases that y'all have been following, things that you're interested in learning more about. So we're hopefully going to cover more of this in the presentation. All right, so next up is Congress. So Congress is specifically the legislative branch of the federal government, right? So we have two houses within Congress. We have the House of Representatives and we have the Senate, right? So we have Congress is supposed to be our legislative lawmaking body of the federal government. We have 435 representatives in the House and we have 100 in the Senate. So the Senate is a smaller house or part of Congress, whereas we have there are larger numbers of House of Representatives total members. The terms are different, right? So we have 2-year terms for folks in the House and we have 6-year terms for folks in the Senate. Elections also happen on different timelines for both the House and the Senate. And they also have different duties, right? And so the House does things like impeaches federal officials. They elect the president in case of electoral college tie. They have, and then the Senate, for example, ratifies treaties, confirms presidential appointments. And so, yeah, so this is just a brief overview of Congress. Breanna, do you have any additions to this or notes on Congress? Kind of just the basics.
No, you covered it perfectly. I just have a petty comment that it's just pretty gridlocked up there, but otherwise you did perfect.
Great. In Senate, so there are different types of leadership within both the Senate and the House of Representatives. We have the presiding officer, we have party leaders and assistant leaders, right? So for example, the vice president actually serves as the president pro tempore, the presiding officer of the Senate, right? Then we have the Speaker of the House. Let me go ahead and pull up. Okay, so for example, the Senate Majority Leader is Chuck Schumer, and Chuck Schumer is like from the Democratic Party, right? But then on the other side, we have the House Speaker, which is Kevin McCarthy, who is from the Republican side. So that kind of gets to what Breanna was mentioning around gridlock, right? So when we have different opposing parties in control of either the Senate or the House of Representatives, that causes a lot of gridlock in terms of lawmaking, because you have to have laws be passed through both the Senate or the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then vice versa, right? If there are any changes in between the laws. And a lot of the times agreements cannot happen during a lot of this like opposing kind of views. And that means that laws that progressive laws are harder to pass through when there's gridlock, and that the laws that are passed through Congress sometimes aren't the laws that will provide actual meaningful change or take a long time to actually get passed through. Yeah. And with that, administrative agencies. So this is also another piece of, I think, the federal government that is kind of like a hybrid between both like the legislative and the executive branches of government at the federal level, right? You have a lot of folks who are appointed by the president, and that's what touches on the executive branch part within administrative agencies, right? And there are a lot of legislative impacts that legislative kind of portions that impact administrative agencies as well. And we'll do a deeper dive in administrative agencies, as I've mentioned before, at our next training. But I just wanted to name that as well, and name that the administrative agencies are actually where a lot of advocacy and power and policy change can happen. So it's not just legislative advocacy, it's also administrative agencies that are implementing these federal policies and programs. For example, the NHOS, as a lot of folks have heard about. This is like a program that is implemented through administrative agencies. And so, yeah, we'll get into that more as well. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Breanna to get through state governments, and then we'll go into how federal and state governments kind of interplay and impact one another.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. And I just want to give it up to Amanda for presenting an entire portion of the presentation just on the fly. That was incredible, and just a comprehensive review. So thank you so much, Amanda. And hey, everybody, again, my name is Breanna Diaz. My pronouns are she and they. And I'm really happy to be back with the PWN fam and see the new members, H&P advocates, the PWN fellows. I'm here to talk about state governments. And, you know, as we said earlier, if you have any questions about anything I'm sharing or have a comment to make, raise your hand, put it in the chat. Always happy to slow down and unpack something more. I talk really fast, I talk a lot. So just tell me to stop talking and we'll unpack something more. But first I'll start off with state government. So Amanda provided a really good overview of the three branches of government, checks and balances, and respective roles and responsibilities, legal or otherwise, for each of those branches. And what exists at the federal level is mirrored at the state level. And we'll unpack that a little bit more, but I wanted to start with this chart that Amanda provided that is an overview of abortion laws by state after the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, the case that had recognized a fundamental right to abortion in the United States. And so this chart, I think it shows very clearly, absent a federal mandate, law, or a Supreme Court decision, the states are able to implement laws and policies that meet their personal political agenda. And so we know with abortion, when we lost the federal rights, states quickly implemented abortion bans or severe restrictions on abortion. Most of those states were located in the South, the Midwest. And as someone that is located in Virginia and a proud Virginian, the sad fact is Virginia remains the last abortion access state in the South. But there are other states that are doing great work to protect access to abortion. You can see those referenced in the colors green and blue. That includes California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and so many more. But I know I'm getting into a monologue about abortion. That's a whole other presentation, but at least just noting that absent a federal law, states can really dictate the terms of a lot of things like reproductive health care. So next slide. Oh wait, you're sharing the screen. Okay, so I forgot, I got really excited. So as I said earlier, like the federal government, at the federal level, the state also is composed of 3 branches of government. And so states have their own legislative branch, which is composed of 2 chambers, a Senate and a House, an executive branch, which is also more commonly referred to as the governor, and a judicial branch. So like the federal courts, which have a district, an appellate, and a Supreme Court, so these 3 layers of courts, states have the exact same process. They have a state district court, they have an appellate court, and then their own version of a Supreme Court. The states use different names and terms for their courts, so they may not be complete mirrors at the state and federal level, but just know that those 3 levels exist at the state and federal. And so states are empowered to pass, enforce, and interpret laws as long as they do not violate the U.S. Constitution. So again, the abortion example, prior to last summer, states could not implement complete bans on abortion. They couldn't implement barriers to abortion that impose an undue burden. But now that Roe has been wiped, the slate is now clean, and we have seen some terrible things pop up. And then finally, most state legislators, mirror the U.S. Congress. As I said, state government, the U.S. Congress is composed of 2 chambers, a Senate and a House of Representatives. State legislators are the same structure. They have a House, sometimes referred to as an assembly, or House of Delegate. Oh, Amanda, killing it. And as well as a Senate. And this chart, I think, more clearly provides an overview of that breakdown. So here we have at the municipal or city level, the executive is referred to as the mayor, at the state level, governor, federal level, president. Those 3 individuals are the executive in their respective level of government, and so forth. The highest, for the higher legislative chamber, at the local level, we have a city council, and that's it. There's not 2 chambers there, but the city council operates in the same function as the state or federal. The higher level of chamber in the state is the Senate, same in the federal is the U.S. Senate, and then the lower chamber for the state is the House or Assembly, and then for the federal, the House of Representatives. So really, these are just the same throughout every level of government. Oh, Deborah, I see your question. Do you refer to the municipal as district? No. So municipal means city or locality. So like I live in Richmond, Virginia, so I fall under the Richmond City Council, or Richmond is the municipality that I live in. It's just like another term. A district is something that has been drawn at the state or federal level that determines your representative, right? But municipal is city. Yeah. I hope that was clear. Again, I talk a lot. Okay, so we're going to break down structures of state government, and we're going to focus on Virginia because I'm not biased at all. So may you click the link, Amanda?
Yeah, do you want to share your screen actually, if you want to click through yourself?
Yes.
Okay, hold on. Let me go ahead and stop share and then feel free to share your screen when you're ready.
All right, please do not be alarmed by my screen. It is just a screen with emails. Okay, so I can't see you all now, so please stop me if I say too much or someone needs something. So this link will be provided in your slide or in the slides to you all to access, but we put this in here. Amanda included this slide just to look specifically at Virginia and how their legislative, judicial, and executive branch mirrors the federal level. And each of your states are going to have a similar makeup, right? So all states are going to have a legislative, judicial, and executive branch. The executive branch is composed of independent administrative agencies as well as departments, right? So I'll slow down. So in the legislative branch here in Virginia, we have the General Assembly, which is our state legislature, which is the one that is composed of a Senate and a House. So they oversee bills and legislation. We have a judicial branch, which is composed of the 3 levels. So we have circuit courts, courts of appeals, and then the Supreme Court of Virginia. And then the executive branch, as we said earlier, go away box, is that we have the governor, we have a lieutenant governor. These two are actually elected separately. And then under the executive branch, the governor has in his cabinet several secretaries that oversee issues, and those secretaries are in charge of key departments. And so, for example, we have here in Virginia a Department of Housing, we have a Department of Corrections, a Department of Education, a Department of Health. And so we just wanted to quickly show those to folks just to show a concrete state example of how state government is set up similar to federal government.
And Breanna, we have a question of, so the government, someone said, so the government and lieutenant governor are elected separately. Is that right?
Yes, here in Virginia, yes. So like they don't run together in a party, you know, like how at the federal level, we have like the president and vice president and they like run together. Not here in Virginia. Like it is just a free for all. So you can, for example, have a Republican governor, but then a Democrat lieutenant governor. They don't run on the same ticket.
Got it. And so is that the case for every state or is it different?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Good.
I wish I knew everything, but then I'd be more unbearable. So any other questions about state makeup branches? Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Hold on, I saw a comment that said, Virginia, we're not biased. Deirdre, that's right. Okay, sorry. I'm just so excited to be with y'all. All right, may you share your screen again, Amanda?
Yes. Let me go ahead and, okay, here we go.
Excellent, thank you so much. Okay, so I think just to nail down on this, hammer down on this point again, there are, for the sake of this conversation, 3 levels of policy, and who that policy impacts is determined by the level the policy lives in. And so, for example, this graphic shows that at the federal level, federal laws and policies apply to everyone throughout the United States. For state laws and policies, those only apply to people who are citizens, residents, or visitors in that particular state. And then there are local laws and policies which apply to people who are citizens, residents, or visitors in that particular city, municipality, or locality. We'll just say city, but those 3 terms typically mean the same thing. I do have like maybe an example of how this can work practically in our lives. And so I'm going to focus on LGBTQ non-discrimination. So at the federal level, we do not have non-discrimination protections in employment, housing, public accommodations on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. there is an effort to add those protections at the federal level via the Equality Act. But right now, there are no federal protections, well, explicit federal protections and non-discrimination for LGBTQ people. However, a majority of states now do have non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. But of course, that is a patchwork. So again, bias for Virginia. Virginia does have protections for LGBTQ people in our non-discrimination law. But if you just drive into West Virginia, those protections no longer exist. Right. So it's just like a patchwork. And then at the local level, we have seen a lot of cities in the South do this, or cities that are in states that aren't really supportive of LGBTQ rights. The cities will then adopt non-discrimination policies or laws. So I'm from Dallas, Texas originally. Dallas, Texas does have protections for LGBTQ people. So I'm protected in Dallas, but maybe I'm not in another state and another city in Texas because the state of Texas doesn't have protections. So it's just a mess. But I just wanted to give that breakdown of like LGBTQ rights by policy. Federalism. I'm just going to read the slide for this one, but this slide is speaking to how there are certain powers are given to the federal government, and that there are certain powers that are given to the state government. And those powers are specific and explicit to those two entities, which means that they cannot, usurp or no, that's a stupid word. Like states can't do what federal government can do and vice versa, right? Like they have enumerated powers that the other one does not have or cannot attempt to do or try. But that's federalism. But we also have the supremacy clause, which says what it sounds like: the Constitution, the US Constitution, and any federal laws that were made constitutionally is the supreme law of the land. And so I think a big example of that can be like Title VII, which has non-discrimination in employment on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion. That is federal law. Because it is federal law, state law cannot oppose or come in or like disagree with that mandate. It is what it is. So in a case of conflict between a federal and state law, the federal law will be applied, period.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize that too, Breanna. I think that is like a very important like concept. I think that like, again, like federal law will trump like state law, right? Federal law is like will impact everyone in the country. Whereas state laws usually are just the laws within that state and impact the residents within that state.
Yeah, I do want to capture a question. Dietz, thank you so much for the catch. I apologize if I'm saying your name wrong, but Dietz said, I thought there were federal discrimination protections in employment via the Supreme Court case, Bostick, where they're accessible to the everyday person. Yeah, so yes, Bostick is a Supreme Court case that did find that Title VII, again, the employment non-discrimination, sex should be read to include sexual orientation and gender identity. You are correct. That is what we say, that federal law and guidance provides those protections for LGBTQ people. What I was trying to say is that there's no like explicit statutory law at the federal level that confers non-discrimination protections. That is case law. That is not statutory law. And there is a bit of a difference there because, like we've seen with the Supreme Court, sometimes opinions can change and people's rights can be wiped out. And so I think like the statutory is just another safeguard for protections for people. I don't know, Amanda, if you want to add or clarify.
Yeah, and so when you say case law, what you mean is cases, these are laws that have developed through the courts, right? The judiciary branch or the judicial system, either that's the federal courts or state courts. So when we talk about case law, those are like the laws that are based on court cases with it. And then for statutory laws, we have, those are statutes created through legislatures. So this is either state laws through your state legislature or federal laws through Congress. And so that's what we mean when we say case law or statutory law. And then we also have LaShonda who has a question.
Yes, my question was for Amanda. You were talking about federal law trumps. What kind of law was it?
State laws. And so, and thank you for that follow-up, because I also meant when they conflict, right? So when state law conflicts with federal law will always win. Yeah, but sorry, did you have a additional question to that?
Yes, I have one more. Excuse me, you said anything about this information for Tennessee.
Sorry, LaShonda, can you repeat the question? I think it got a little fuzzy.
Yes. How do I find out all this information for Tennessee?
Yes, we will actually go through that, right, Breanna? I think we will. Okay, yes. So we'll get to that.
Okay.
I think,
okay.
yeah.
Thank
And then, yeah, no problem. Great question. And then I think Brielle, you had a question?
No, I was just speaking to everybody because I came on a little late. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Brielle, welcome. Great to have you.
Hey, Brielle.
Hey, Sharon.
It's Miss Sarah.
Miss Sarah.
Awesome. Great questions, by the way. And I think just shows like the complicatedness of the like the system that we live in, the system of government we live in, but like we are all becoming experts through these presentations and through experience. So like, please keep these questions coming. It's been hours talking about the judicial branch, honestly. Okay, so back to the Venn diagram of federal versus state powers. So this is a really great graphic that shows, what are powers that only the federal government have, what are powers that only the state government has, and then what are powers that they share. Oh, we love. And so here you can see in the federal bubble, which is in yellow, the federal government has the sole power to create the rules of naturalization, which is who can become a citizen, who cannot. The federal government has the sole power to coin money. And I love the example in the notes that, we can't have multiple states coining or creating their own currency. That would just be chaos. So the federal government has the sole authority to coin, print, and provide money. And then the federal government also has the sole authority to declare war and raise an army. So I think pretty common examples. Some concurrent powers that they have is that both federal and state government can collect taxes. So a lot of us live in states that have both a state and federal tax. Yes, there are some states that don't have a state tax, like Texas or Florida. I think New Hampshire as well. But that is, I think, a choice that the states made, and they have different ways of getting those taxes, but generally federal and states both collect taxes. They both establish their courts, both make and enforce criminal laws. I actually just learned today that Virginia has, I think, 1,100 laws or criminal laws creating felonies. We have one of the most in the country. I had no idea. 1,100 felonies. Anyways, that's another rant, but states have that power. Powers that are specific to the states is that they set up the school system. They regulate marriage, which was a big debate, a decade or so ago around same-sex marriage, and can regulate corporations and business. So these are just a few examples, but we think paint a clear picture about what federal and state governments have power over. Check in. So we'd love to hear from you all in the chat, or if you want to share, what is one issue you have been following in your state legislature? It's been a busy year. I'm sure there's a lot.
Awesome. I see a lot of action in the chat right now. Reproductive rights, gender affirming care, abortion and anti-trans bills. Yes, definitely all of this. Reproductive rights, abortion. Yeah, a ton. Maryland's repeal of its HIV criminal laws, gun laws. Criminalization laws, anti-trans laws. Yep.
Sorry, I went on mute because my dog was barking. She wanted to tell me her opinions too, I guess. These are all really great. Oh, yes, sex workers' rights. Yes. Respect for Marriage Act.
I see a comment from Kaneen, a wonderful PWN policy fellow. So state power is actually more democratic, whereas federal is more of a republic, keeping power in the hands of the status quo. Restricted education on gender identity and sexual orientation, book banned.
Yes.
Yep. Antiquated HIV criminalization laws. Yes, exactly what our Health Not Prisons advocates are working on changing. Critical race theory, exactly. A lot of work to oppose critical race theory being taught in schools. Yeah, exactly. Great, thank you guys. Thank you all for sharing, excuse me. You know, this is all really great. Okay, do you have anything, do you want to move us into federal and state policies and how they intersect?
Yes, happy to. Thank you. So this next section is we're going to focus on how these two entities intersect. And so lots of federal programs are actually run on the state and local level. This gives advocates multiple avenues for influencing the process. So at the federal level, you can work on things like overly yearly funding or appropriations for a program, or you can ask the federal government to make new rules about how states, localities, and organizations can use that money. And then at the state level, you can do things like join planning councils that oversee how that funding is being used, and if it's working for the program it's being allocated to. You can also influence state laws about federal programs, and so much more. So I think we're going to walk through a couple of examples of how federal and state policies and laws intersect. Okay, sorry, let me catch up. Sorry, I was looking at the chat. So first we'll look at federal spending. Federal spending shapes state policies and programs. Yes, 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 yes. One of the big ways that the federal government and state governments ensure compliance to a stated policy goal or a law is to tie money to it. That's just how a lot of this enforcement works in this country. And so federal funds that go to state and local governments to help finance critical programs and services is essential to their success. So these federal funds can support healthcare, public education, housing, community development. I mean, truly everything listed I have in front of me is long: childcare, job training, transportation, clean water, and so much more. There is probably something like multiple things in your life that you encounter or use daily that is funded via federal funds, but likely overseen by state government or a program. So some of these federal funds will go directly to state governments, but sometimes these federal funds will go to organizations in the state who qualify for the federal grants. And so I know we'll talk about both, but I'm sure folks on this call are already familiar. Yeah, sorry, like 340B, like we already know folks are familiar with, are active members of these programs, these community organizations that oversee federal funds to programs. So next slide. All right. Okay, sorry, I got excited, got too far. So this first example is on joint state and federal programs. The example is Medicaid. And so these are programs that are run. So these joint state and federal programs are those that are run by both the state and federal government. And usually the federal government has rules in place for how to use the money and the basic requirements of the programs. And so the level of flexibility that states has changes based upon the programs we're talking about. And so I'm just going to walk through this example, and like Amanda, please add to, or like anything I miss or misstate. But for Medicaid, it is a joint federal and state public insurance program. Each state operates its own Medicaid program within federal guidelines. And then the federal guidelines are intentionally broad, so states have a great deal of flexibility in designing and administrating their programs. And so I think a common saying you might hear is that, you know, the federal law sets the floor, not the ceiling, for what can be funded, what parameters can be created, and how money is used. And so I think because we're talking about abortion so much, I know this has Medicaid as the example, but another example in relation to Medicaid is the Hyde Amendment at the federal level, which says that, you know, federal funds may not be used to fund abortion except in two limited exceptions, which is like rape or life, health, safety of the pregnant person. So those are the two exceptions for which federal funding may be used for abortion. However, there are states that have additional exceptions because those are just the floor. So, right, so states can create more exceptions. And so here in Virginia, we have a third exception where it is a like incapacitating physical, like fetal anomaly, like incapacitating fetal anomaly. Those folks can also qualify for Medicaid funding for abortion. So Hyde said here are two exceptions, but Virginia said here are three. And so that is a strict federal restriction that a state has expanded. Amanda, do you want to add something to this Medicaid, or may I move on? I just want to make sure I hit the point you wanted.
No, we're good. We can move on.
Yeah, okay. So then federal grant programs. So federal grant programs give funds to states, counties, localities, community organizations, and so many other entities that provide services or implement a program. And so I know folks on here are the experts and will know, are more familiar with the federal grants themselves and the programs that they fund. But some examples are Title X Family Planning Program, HOPWA, the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program. So, you know, essentially these laws, like HOPWA, establish a framework or program to meet a specific goal or outcome, but how it's able to reach that goal or outcome is done through these programs that are funded via federal grants at the state and local level. And I think we'll break that down a little bit more. Oh, yes, we will. Here we go. Okay, so an example of a federal grant program is Ryan White. And so, you know, there's federal funding for this program, which is appropriated by Congress annually via the budget. Funding increases almost every year, but has not kept pace with inflation. So that means that because inflation is more than like the value of the currency, that actually money is going down, or it's not meeting the actual needs of folks who rely on this program. And the Ryan White program is composed of multiple parts. We've already heard folks reference one part. There is Part B. So funding is provided to states and territories. Part B, cities is Part A, to providers, community-based organizations, and other institutions via Part C, D, and F. And that funding is provided through grants that those states, cities, community organizations may apply for to implement programs consistent with the mandate of the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program. So grantees can design key aspects of their programs like client eligibility, the service priorities, the services they provide. So there is a lot of discretion given to the entities that apply for the money. It's just like Ryan White establishes that bucket of money folks can apply for. And so I think, yeah, the slide has additional examples. So example requirements for grantees. This is established by the law that it requires grantees to spend 75% or more of the program funds on core medical services, at least under parts A through C. So yeah, I think this is just an attempt to show how federal grant programs exist and operate. And again, how a lot of folks involved in these organizations or in like state planning councils or city planning councils really get to shape and determine how that funding is used. Okay, and then
it looks like, sorry. Yes, I think we have a couple questions actually for me. And the question was, so is the trick to find basically a loophole, so to speak, in federal policy to work in favor locally in individual states? I guess this goes to maybe kind of how you can advocate locally around like federal policy.
may you repeat the question? I'm so sorry, I blanked.
Yeah. So Canadian asked in the chat, is the trick to find loopholes, so to speak, in federal policy in order to work those loopholes in favor locally, basically, in your state? I guess it seems like the question might be going to, and can you feel free to clarify my question, but like, how do folks kind of like on a state level advocate around like federal programs?
That is a really good question. And right now at the moment, I'm blanking on how to answer that, but maybe at the end I can think and type, but if somebody else has a response, please respond.
That 75% on core medical, you have the opportunity as a jurisdiction to apply for a waiver. So more money can be spent on social services. You don't get a whole lot of leeway in that, but if you ask my personal opinion, social services it used to be 50-50. And that still wasn't enough for social services. So 75-25, that was not going to fly with most active jurisdictions. So in Maryland, we file for a waiver every year and to increase funding to much needed social services. And not that the core medical is not necessary, but what matters most to people living with HIV is not always the medical or biomedical portion of care.
Thank you for that addition, Melanie. Appreciate it. And I think Kaneen, you have your hand up as well.
So what I was gonna say was, I feel like when she was saying that the federal government creates the floor and that each individual state can't override it, but they can add another way of spending those monies. Like they can find a way within the parameters of what the federal government has made allotted for to be more clear about and more specific about how we're going to allocate additional funds. Like the examples that she gave was, mandatory abortion because you're raped or because it was endangering the fetus. And so then the other one was if if I think it was like if if it wasn't stable or if it wasn't safe or something, like it was another example that she gave. And so my question was basically just, you know, just like I felt like she said it, but like, is that what local government does? Try to find ways to work within what the federal government allows for, and just, you know, like to become more specific about what we're asking for in policy, but trying to keep it within the parameters of what the federal government has set at the floor level. Like, because I was kind of confused about the floor, because when I think of the floor, I think that maybe this is something that we can build up from, but then again, maybe the floor is like, we can't go beyond this. So because I'm an artist, this could go either way. So I want to know if can we add to it, or is this where it stops? Like, is we can't work beyond this point?
I would say it depends on the political environment in which your state has to deal with, because some states, they want even more restrictions than the federal government allows, okay? And then like Maryland, we don't buy into that. We have full access to reproductive health care, which includes abortions under any circumstances, but that's not true in a lot of states.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you unpacking that, and then sharing your response and experience in Maryland, Melanie. That is, yeah, it's I'm trying to think of like another example, because I talked about the Hyde Amendment as like the federal law, but then states can provide additional exceptions to like Medicaid funding abortions for pregnant folks. I think maybe another example is like, we have federal non-discrimination protections in employment. So Title VII, which is like race, ethnicity, religion, and sex. But states are required to have the same level of protection for those classifications, but they can add additional classifications if they want to expand the scope of those protections. But again, I don't want to, I think, like simplify it so much, because the federal government, when they set that floor, can also set strict parameters that prevent the states from doing what they want entirely. Like the federal government can dictate and mandate that states cannot do, you know, X, Y, and Z, but absent that explicit, you cannot do this, there is the argument to be made that states can pursue more comprehensive protections. I don't know if that was at all helpful.
And I think it may also go to kind of like the federal programs and the idea of tying funding to certain programs. If like, for example, and using that as like an enforcement mechanism to ensure that states actually don't do certain things. Otherwise, they will pull that funding of that program away from the state. So I guess that's another example of kind of creating that floor of like what states can or cannot do based off of federal grants and programs at a state level.
Awesome. Okay, so this is my final slide. And I just wanted to do another case study about federal and state law, where sometimes it conflicts, because I think we're seeing that in a lot of the states that we're in. I heard a lot of people address like trans rights, trans justice, and issues. And so I wanted to look at a thing that we're experiencing here in Virginia. And so quickly, in 2021, we had a law passed here in Virginia that mandated the creation of model policies for transgender and non-binary students in our public schools. And so these model policies were to be developed by community stakeholders and released by the Virginia Department of Education. And all of our public school districts were legally required to adopt these model policies to ensure the rights of trans youth in school. So that's like the right to use the bathroom consistent with your gender identity, to play sports, to not be forcibly outed to maybe an unsupportive family. Anti-bullying, like so many just basic rights that exist in federal law and in some states. So these policies passed. But unfortunately, our current governor, who is very hostile towards trans folks, and I mean, anybody who's marginalized, our current governor has now attempted to rescind those good policies and replace them with parental rights policies. And so that looks like forcibly outing children, dead naming children, and denying access to mental health services for youth questioning their identity in schools. Like, it is just disgusting. Fortunately, these policies have not been implemented yet, but we anticipate them here in Virginia to drop any moment. And we know that the consequences will be dire for for all youth, but in particular trans and non-binary students. And so what we have right now in this example is a state actor acting in direct conflict with federal and state law. And so what I mean by that is, at the federal level, we know that Title VII, which is non-discrimination, and Title IX, which is non-discrimination in education, prohibits state and local schools from discriminating against trans youth or trans students. But we have a state governor who's seeking to do just that. And so if these model policies are implemented, it opens up Virginia to the potential for a lot of issues, whether it's lawsuits or just general harm against students, because arguably the model policies violate federal law. And so I think these are issues we're seeing across the country right now, where we see states trying to or passing, trans sports bans or classroom censorship, like anti-critical race theory. And we see that these lawsuits are popping up, challenging these state laws because they are in direct conflict with federal law and guidance. So just like a long-winded way of saying, when states act badly, there will be an intervention.
Thanks, Breanna. And I think that's like a great point too. Like, an intervention in this case, for example, was advocates filing lawsuits in federal court to argue that their federal rights were violated because of state law. And so that's how federal courts kind of intervened in this case. Or in a lot of these cases in which federal courts are declaring that certain anti-trans legislation at a state level is unconstitutional. So, yeah. Awesome. Does anyone? Okay, with that, I think we are going to move into questions. And I know we've been taking questions throughout the presentation. So really appreciate everyone just asking those questions in real time and as we go along with the content. But if anyone else has any questions just generally about the content, anything that or even just examples of advocacy that y'all want to share, I'd love to hear that as well. So feel free to raise your hand or ask your question in the chat. Go ahead, Robin.
Yes, thank you. I was watching live stream and I put it in the chat there, but I finally was able to get on here. So question is about the ADA. And at one point in time, the last time I knew of this was 8 to 10 years ago, but all persons living with HIV were covered as a protected class in the ADA, which is not the same as in other federal. Is that still true? Do you know? The American Disabilities Act.
I was looking at the chat. So does the ADA still provide protections for folks living with HIV? Was that the question?
Right, right. At one point in time, it was all persons living with HIV, which is very different than other sectors of the law. And even when people qualify for disability, it has nothing to do with that. But it was just that the American Disabilities Act under the Department of Justice included discrimination against all persons living with HIV.
Sadly, I'm not a subject matter expert on the ADA, so I can't speak concretely, but I do understand that yes, people living with HIV, that is considered like a disability for protections or status under the ADA, but that is a very umbrella response. I can't answer or speak to the specifics of how that plays out.
Right.
I
Thank you.
apologize.
No, thank you.
Camille?
So I'm not gonna go too much into detail because it's still kind of fresh, but this is in regards to bodily autonomy, and I feel like it kind of took me, like, I felt connected with the Roe versus Wade decision, like with bodily autonomy, when you're in a situation with someone, and also just as a trans person, having to disclose about being trans, and then having to disclose about my status. All of these things intersect, like having the right to not have to tell a person something, or give a person, like, it's like giving a person control over your body when you have to tell them your gender or your status. It's like relinquishing control of your body, because now they can spread that, they can make determinations about you, call you dirty, call you, say just discouraging, disparaging things to you. And so I experienced that recently, and it was a very traumatic experience. And I felt, like, because I'm not ashamed to say it, but I normally don't say it unless they ask. It's not like hey, I think you should know. It's more so like, if it comes up, I'll say it, because I talk about it on the internet. Like, you could Google me and see it. And so it's not my thing to just be like, hey, that's not what I do. But, so, and then with U equals U is like, and a lot of people don't know about that, but I feel like the law that allows us to be persecuted because of our status, they say, oh, you didn't tell me, or oh, you didn't communicate that. I feel like that's just another way to control our bodies. And so that, like, that's another way to give, to like relinquish my physical autonomy, because now this person can, just create this narrative of me. Like, he literally actually said that you're an advocate to protect people from people like you. And my response to that was, no, I'm an advocate because I'm trying to help to erase stigma created by people like you. But it was still, it was still hurtful. So, like, I just realized, I think that was like an aha moment for me when that happened to me, how the Roe versus Wade decision, being trans and being positive, how they all kind of intersect. And I just wanted to share that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kaneen. Yeah, I definitely appreciate you tying in kind of case law of Roe v. Wade with bodily autonomy in your experiences. So really appreciate that connection. And I think Brielle as well, you have your hand up.
Yes. I just wanted to relate to something that she said. Can y'all hear me? Okay. Yeah, and I totally understand what you're saying on that, because I have experienced that too in the past, and it can be very traumatizing, and in some cases it can cause people to commit suicide or anything like that. So I really feel like for Texas, like our government, I really feel like the things that he's focusing on is not for the greater good for Texas, but only for the greater good for himself. And I don't know if it's something that he might experience with someone or something, but it's like it's all of a sudden he's just attacking. And even though it's not me, but because I represent that community, it hurts. It cuts. And I'm like, wow, why are you doing this? That is just you talk about, they talk about justice for all, they talk about this, that, and the next, but where's the justice in that? You do not know what the people go through, like them kids go through. I know I went through having to hold my secret for so long before I released it. So, and for someone to just tell you something like that, he's ignorant. He's ignorant and lack knowledge in what he's speaking of. He's just saying what he's saying because he probably can't get what he wants. So let him be ignorant, and you keep doing what you're doing. Don't let it discourage you. Not saying it will, but just keep on keeping on. That's what my grandma used to tell me.
Thanks so much, Brielle, for that addition. And I think exactly a great example of how much power the executive branch, the governor in Texas, for example, has within policymaking within the state, right? And an entire legislature, right? State legislature, the Texas legislature created legislation that was then passed or signed by the governor. And the governor can also, for example, create executive orders that basically create policy that impact the entire state, right? As well. So there's that added component of not only lawmaking in the legislature, but also just the amount of power that each state governor has in creating policy. And I think like the real like impact and the lives of like people are on the line. I think that's very clear, right? And yeah, so I think thank you for providing like kind of just like the urgency and the importance of like the impact of these laws, especially these like anti-trans, especially for youth, trans youth laws as well. Okay, with that, I think that is a good way for us to close out this presentation. Thank you so much, Brielle and Kaneen, for adding that context and important comments. So quickly wanted to provide a save the date. So we have more trainings. This is just the beginning. This is going to be the first kind of more substantive content training of many. Monthly, we will be holding trainings around different aspects of policy, right? So today was understanding the state and federal government and the branches of government and how state and federal law kind of intersect. Next month, on July 13th, we will be unpacking administrative versus legislative advocacy. And this will be specifically on the federal level. So we're excited to have additional presenters come in to learn with y'all and to present on their expertise and their knowledge around administrative advocacy and legislative advocacy. So definitely sign up and RSVP through the Mobilize links in the emails or through our Facebook page. We have posts with those links as well. Save the date for July 13th. And for PWN Policy Fellows, you have your monthly mentor call next month on July 18th as well. So just wanted to highlight those upcoming dates. And with that, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my my email in the chat, and a big thank you and round of applause to Breanna for sharing her time and knowledge and expertise with us today. Yes, if we could all give Breanna a huge round of applause and show our gratitude to her. We really appreciate you coming back and welcome. It was so great to have you back in a PWN space. Awesome, y'all. Have a great rest of your day, and we will catch you later.